Hello, and welcome to the third podcast of Security. Don't be a sheep, be a lion. Today, I'm going to be interviewing a special guest. This gentleman I've known for many, many years, probably at least 18 years, and he's a very interesting individual. We have worked together and partnered doing at least 30 water districts for security risk vulnerability assessments. And we've done various other corporations and companies doing security risk assessments and emergency response plans. So let me briefly introduce Mr. Rick Hahn, and then I'll, of course, ask him to expound on my introduction. But Rick did 32 years as an agent with the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he handles some very interesting and important cases that have historical relevance to what's going on today. He's a counterterrorism expert, a friend, a colleague, and a professional. And I would like for everyone to be introduced to my good friend and partner, Rick Hahn.
Good morning, Ron. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Very flattering. As Ron said, I spent 32 years with the FBI. And early on in my career, I was in New York City when an organization called the FALN, Puerto Rican terrorist organization, started their campaign of bombing. And I was fortunate enough to be part of a new squad that was formed in 1974 that responded to the bombings of the FALN. And that pretty much set up the direction of my career. Over the years, I became a bomb technician and ultimately became one of the FBI Laboratory Explosive Units examiners, which is a very elite unit and goes all over the world in response to attacks against U.S. interests. So, Ron, what would you like to talk about today?
Well, I want you to interweave your experience with the FBI. You have some amazing experiences, and interweave the fact that you and I have worked together to do a lot of security risk vulnerability assessments and emergency response plans over the years that we've known each other. But primarily, I'd like for you to kind of get into your experience in some of the bombing investigations that you participated in, because some of the factual information that you have is just amazing. So if you'll talk a little bit about your experience as a case agent on some of those bombings, I think our audience would really enjoy hearing about those investigations.
Okay, well, let me begin by talking about the FALN because that was, again, really where my career and my orientation towards bombings and terrorism began. I spent 3 years in New York working FALN bombing cases. And the FALN, by the way, it's Armed Forces of National Liberation, Puerto Rico. They were the most prolific terrorist group America has ever seen in terms of numbers. They did over 112 bombing and incendiary attacks. In my 3 years in New York, we were totally unable to solve these cases. And somebody at FBI headquarters wanted someone who knew the cases to go to Puerto Rico. And I raised my hand. I was fortunate enough to go through 5 months of language training, worked in Puerto Rico for 3 years while the FALN and the Macheteros in Puerto Rico continued their bombing campaigns and other attacks. And then I got transferred back to Chicago, which is my hometown, in 1980. And they had just arrested 11 FALM members, one of whom decided to cooperate. And again, I was fortunate enough to interview him, and he told me this individual knew nothing about anyone that had not been arrested with him. And he knew nothing about any place that that the FBI had not already found and searched. But what he did know was how they were trained. And I took that information and working with local police and state police and the Secret Service, we located and penetrated with court orders a terrorist safe house. And it was the first terrorist safe house ever penetrated in the United States. And we actually have videos of them building firing circuits for bombs, cleaning weapons, and we stopped breakouts, we stopped bombings, we stopped armed robberies, and ultimately arrested, unfortunately, only 4 people. But the bottom line is it was a landmark case because it started an understanding of how the terrorists are trained and how we can counter that. That experience and my experience working the bombing cases led me to be invited by the FBI Laboratory Explosives Unit to enter that unit as an examiner. And so in 1987, that's exactly what I did. I eschewed normal promotions, and I went to the FBI laboratory, was trained as an explosives examiner, and that led to my international travels and my leadership in various landmark bombing cases. For example, in December 1988, a 747 airliner going from Heathrow in London to New York was bombed, and the aircraft came apart in seconds. The debris scattered over southern Scotland, over 845 square miles. Now you can imagine this aircraft was going at 31,000 feet and moving at 500 miles an hour at the time. And it literally came apart in seconds. And we know that because a radar station in Scotland was watching, and it recorded all the radar sweeps. And every 15 seconds, it would make a 360-degree sweep. And in 15 seconds, they saw it go from 1 radar image to 4 radar images. So it came apart very rapidly, which must have just been absolutely terrifying for the people on board for those few seconds that they lived before the freezing air and debris and whatnot ended their lives. People literally rained down on the town of Lockerbie, Scotland. And the FBI, along with NTSB and National Transportation Safety Board and FAA, Federal Aviation Administration personnel responded. And I was fortunate enough to be assigned to train the Scots in looking for explosive damage to soft materials. And the reason for that is because early on, a colleague of mine in the explosives unit, Tom Thurman, had identified explosive damage on one of the cargo container skids. And so we knew within 4 days of the aircraft coming down that it had been a bombing because of the high explosive damage, which is something that, again, as an explosives expert, I was trained to look at. Tom Thurman was trained to recognize. He recognized it on the 23rd of December. On the 25th of December, he found the second half of that skid rail, and it turned the investigation from a possible accident into a criminal investigation. My role in that investigation, again, was training Scottish police to determine the difference between impact damage, fire damage, and explosive damage on soft materials like luggage and clothing and whatnot. And that allowed us to separate things that were damaged explosively from things that were damaged in other ways. And the things that were damaged explosively were sent to the laboratory, the British laboratory in London, where they're examined. Now, there are thousands and thousands of pieces that were collected in the fields. One of the first things identified as the FBI, my fellow technicians, worked through reconstruction of the cargo container was a piece of circuit board from a Toshiba radio. And ultimately, we determined that that Toshiba radio was used to contain the bomb itself. Also recovered pieces of plastic that were actually stuck to the clothing, because at the time that the explosion occurred, they were so close to the explosive that the heat melted the plastic and then fused it into clothing that was recovered. And that was determined to be a Samsonite suitcase. And it was kind of unusual because there are only less than 500 of them made, as it was a prototype. And then ultimately, again, in those pieces of clothing, a small fragment of circuit board, no bigger than your thumbnail, ended up solving the case. And the way that happened is because that particular unique piece of circuit board, first of all, clearly was hand laid out circuit as opposed to a computer aided design. And that piece of circuit board ended up being matched, again by Tom Thurman, my colleague, to a circuit board that had been seized in the country of Togo by the CIA. And the CIA actually provided that seized circuit board, which was part of a timer that had the trade name of the manufacturer being a small little company in Switzerland. That company, owned by just two individuals, admitted that they had made that for the Libyan government. And they ended up identifying the people that actually were responsible and ultimately were charged in that case. So this, out of a crime scene field of 845 square miles, and mind you, the British, worked that crime scene for over a year collecting evidence. But out of all that, and this is a 747 consists of over 6 million parts. Now, about 3 million of those are fasteners, rivets and nuts and bolts and stuff, but another 3 million pieces that aren't. And then all the luggage of 259 people, all their luggage and any cargo that might have been on board gets spread over 845 square miles. And out of all of that, one small fragment, less than an inch square, of plastic circuit board ends up solving the case. And ultimately, Libya not only allowed for prosecution of two people, only one of which was convicted, by the way, but it was prosecuted in Scottish court. But in addition to that, they paid reparations to the families, which was an acknowledgement that they, in fact, their intelligence service had, in fact, bombed that aircraft. So that kind of thing, the attention to detail, the diligence that went into it, those are the sorts of things that I carry, and I know you carry, Ron, in our work in talent. Secure strategies, for example, where we do vulnerability assessments, we pay attention to every little detail, leave no stone unturned. So go ahead, Ron.
Well, that I've always when you first told me that about the Pan Am 103 bombing, I was totally amazed at the scope of how far the debris landed for 800 and some odd square miles. And to find a very small thumbnail uh, on a circuit board was, to me, maybe I'm being, you know, a little inquiring, but I just found it like an impossibility, and it's amazing. Uh, Rick, tell us a little bit about the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, because most folks associate the World Trade Center bombing as a 9/11 2001 event, but the actual first bombing occurred in 1993. And tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. So, again, the FBI Laboratory Explosives Unit was asked to respond. The forensic leader was a guy by the name of Dave Williams, a colleague of mine in the unit. And he arrived on Saturday, the day after the bombing. The bombing occurred around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, on a Friday afternoon, the 26th of February. And the bomb was about 2,000 pounds of explosives, homemade explosives, in a van, and they parked the van on the B2 level of the World Trade Center Plaza. Now, for some sort of orientation here, the World Trade Center towers are only part of that complex. The complex itself is actually the full square block. And subterranean, underneath street level, they had 3 parking levels, and then they had 3 more levels with mechanical equipment, things like that. Um, they, the perpetrators, had hoped to break the foundation of World Trade Center 1, the North Tower, and thereby cause it to topple, and wanted a domino effect of one building falling into another in hopes of killing as many as 250,000 people. That is a statement that was made by the person who designed the bomb, Mr. Ramzi Youssef. So I didn't arrive until Monday. And at that point, my colleague David was up in the command center run by the FBI office in New York, and that was a mile away. And I offered to him that I would run things at the actual crime scene. And he agreed, and so I did. I took up that responsibility. What had happened before I even got there is that, now mind you, there's 4 principal agencies here. There's the New York Bomb Squad, of course, they have an interest in it. The owners of the building were the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, and they have their own police department. Of course, ATF, which is an agency with responsibility over explosives, and the FBI, which is has the responsibility not only for explosives but terrorism. And so David was trying to make sure that as this crime scene started, and we were all looking for physical evidence, right, to try and solve the case. As this started, he wanted to make sure that there were ground rules set so that everybody was on the same page. And that only makes sense because different agencies have different protocols, different training, that sort of thing. So on a Sunday, the Sunday after the bombing, uh, Dave was approached by members of the New York PD, ATF, and they lobbied him to allow them to go down into the basements, the B2 level where the bomb had gone off, and start to survey it so that they could figure out how they were going to approach this crime scene. Now, mind you, this basement is 6 levels. The bomb goes off on the B2 level and it creates a hole over 100 meters in diameter. And all that concrete and steel and cars drop down successively through the B3 level, the B4 level, the B5 level, ultimately settling on the B6 level. Now, each successive hole is slightly smaller, but the bottom line is you have 125,000 tons of debris that's dropped into this. And because of safety reasons, all the electricity is cut off in those basement levels. So going in there, the only lighting you had would be a handheld light, or they have what they call safety lights that strap around your chest, and they're fluorescent lamps. Um, but you're going basically into a coal mine with no lighting. David asked how they anticipated they would get into that basement, and they pointed out that one of the New York bomb techs by the name of Don Sadawi had been down there both Saturday and Sunday. And so David allowed Don Sadawi to go down into that basement and lead 8 other examiners, ATF, New York PD, and a couple of FBI chemists to take swabbings. And the rule was you can make sketches, you could take photographs, you could take swabbings, but no piece of evidence is to leave that site. It's not even to be moved. So Don Sadawi leads them down. Now, Don Sadawi, oddly enough, had attended the Brooklyn Automotive Engineering High School, which is a school for people who want vocationally to be involved in the automotive industry, design and whatnot. And he, of course, knows automobiles far better than the average citizen. So Don leads this crew of 8 down, and no more does he get down there than his job is done, basically. And he starts looking around because he's not taking photographs, he's not making sketches, he's not taking swabs, but he sees a couple of ring gears, and ring gears are part of a differential, part of the transmission of an automobile. And it draws his attention. He picks it up, and then he looks another 15 feet forward, and there's another ring gear, and he goes and picks that up, and they fit together. And then he goes and sees a pinion gear, which is also part of a differential, and he picks that up, and it fits together. And he's putting together a 3D puzzle, if you will. And he gets a little farther out from the edge of the crater, and he finds the differential casing, and he picks it up and puts it on top of these ring gears, and it fits. And when he looks at it, he realizes that it has high explosive damage. And he knows that the only way it could possibly have high explosive damage is if it were in probably less than 18 inches of the explosion itself. And he tells himself, this came from the vehicle that carried the bomb. And with that, and again, this is one of these cases of the right guy in the right place at the right time. With that, he turns and looks back towards the crater. And there's a slab of concrete, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet, hanging by rebar. And on it, he sees what he recognizes as automotive frame rail. And he knows that frame rail can have confidential vehicle identification numbers. So he independently bellies out on that slab of concrete, risking his own life, grabs hold of that piece, drags it back onto solid ground, runs his fingers through it, and he feels what he thinks is an identification number. And he says to the other 8 guys, we have to take this. And they're all like, no, 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 we can't take it. We can't take it. He's like, wait, this is part of the automobile that carried the bomb. We have to take it. With that, he goes up to the street level where there are crime scene vehicles and police waiting. And he gets a body bag and a basket, brings them down, puts these parts into the body bag and into the basket, and has one of the ATF agents that's there help him get it back up onto street level and into a crime scene vehicle. Now, mind you, the press is standing by through all this because the press knows, amongst other things, that at least one person that was known to be in the vicinity of the bomb is still missing. He was an employee of the World Trade Center. And so he tells the crime scene vehicle drivers and the other cops there, take this as if you're going to the morgue. because the press will think that we found the body of Wilfredo Mercado. But as soon as you're sure that the press is no longer following you, turn around, take this to the NYPD lab. And that's what they did. And the next morning at the NYPD lab, they found the confidential VIN, vehicle identification number, on that frame rail member. And when they traced it, they found that it was rented in Jersey City by a person who had been a suspect in the killing of a rabbi in New York 2 years earlier, Meir Kahane, and who had been under investigation by the FBI as part of a mosque in Jersey City that was suspected of plotting to do various crimes here in the United States. And the FBI had shut down that case, but of course, they reactivated it. They reactivated informants that they had. They were able on Friday, a week after the bombing, to arrest 4 individuals. The mastermind of this was, as I said, Ramzi Youssef, who escaped, unfortunately. But the bottom line is that case was solved, and because the FBI reactivated their informants, they determined that other adherents at the mosque in Jersey City were planning to conduct 5 bombings. They're going to bomb the George Washington Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Holland Tunnel, the FBI offices in Manhattan, and I can't recall exactly what the 5th target was. But the bottom line is that because we were able to determine that and penetrate that plot, we stopped that from happening. Now, so the consequences of this individual, one individual with just the right training, being in exactly the right time, place at the right time, basically solved the case. And he went against all instructions based on his instincts. Interesting story. The unfortunate part is that Ramzi Youssef, whose uncle was Mohammed, I can't think of his last name. His uncle is the one who designed the plot to fly airliners into the World Trade Center. And actually, as they were transporting, Ramzi Youssef was captured in 1995 in Pakistan, and it was brought back to the United States to stand trial. And as they transported him from JFK to the Metropolitan Correction Center via helicopter, the agents on board the helicopter pointed out that the World Trade Center towers were still standing. And Ramzi Youssef's response was, yes, but if I'd had more money and more time, they wouldn't be. So, and unfortunately, his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that's his full name, again, designed the plot to fly airliners into the World Trade Center and did, in fact, bring him down. But fascinating story. One of those things where it was just the perfectly right guy in the right place at the right time. And one of the chemists that had been down there with them on that Sunday afternoon when Don Sadawi decided to take that frame rail was back at the same place on Monday around noon. And he noted that the piece of concrete that Don Sadawi had skinnied out onto to get that piece of frame rail had been pancaked by other falling debris. So that if Don had not taken that frame rail when he did, chances are it would have been lost forever. And we may never have solved that case. So it's
Thank,
putting the right guy in the right place at the right time. And that's something that Talon tries to do across the board in investigations, in protective details, and of course in doing vulnerability assessments and business continuity planning.
yeah, let me sort of talk a little bit about our experience with with security risk vulnerability assessments that Rick and I have done over the years. in 2003, based on the fact that when they arrested Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he was a water engineer and he had plans on how to contaminate water. And so the federal government put together a bioterrorism response bill of 2003, providing about $150,000 per water district that served over 100,000 people, customers. We were hired with Boyle Engineering to conduct those security risk assessments. And one of the things that I noted when we started was this is only for a physical assessment. And I kept pressing for doing a cyber assessment because of the SCADA system, which was attached really to the internet, which was a major vulnerability that we saw. And we couldn't get any traction, but we finally got a traction by a water district in Central California to do the cyber part of the security risk vulnerability assessment. And we found a malicious application on the system that would have allowed somebody with an administrative authority to come back into the system, and they could have contaminated the water or shut down the pipes and then reinstalled the pipes, restarted the pipes and busted them, and destroyed distribution of water to well over 100,000 people. Out of this came the Talon concept of convergence, and that is you cannot have physical security without cybersecurity involved in a seamless methodology, and you can't have cybersecurity without physical security. Next week, we'll have Rick Hahn back, and we will discuss doing the physical security assessments, why you should do them, and how they're done. So thank you very much for listening and seeing our program today.